Priya Nanjappa is the Vice President of Conservation Programs at the National Parks Conservation Association. She has a bachelor's and master's degree in biology with emphases in wildlife ecology, conservation biology, and environmental science. Her experiences include work with federal and state government, nonprofits, and she has coordinated and led interdisciplinary teams at state, national, and international scales. Priya is passionate about inclusivity, equity, and diversity, and has applied these in her positions where she is able to influence and create beneficial changes in policies and practices. She recently served as a mentor in the inaugural cohort of Next 100 Colorado, designed to help connect Colorado's emerging and seasoned leaders of color through a series of partnerships, network formation, and leadership building. She also really loves toads, as do we at the Nature Center. And outside of work, you can find her looking for them or just hiking and camping. And there's so many more things that we could say about Priya, but that is our condensed introduction for her tonight. So with that, I am going to turn the floor over to Priya, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to those as we go along here. All right. Take it away, Priya.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Maria, for the invitation. And thanks to all of you who have taken some time out of your night to listen to this talk. I'm just really honored to be here. And I have a lot of friends and colleagues from Ohio who said a lot of wonderful things about Cincinnati Nature Center. And so hopefully one day I can come out and explore. But I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. And so, as you can see from my title, I am going to tell you a little bit about my winding path that started off with wildlife ecology and herpetology in particular, which is the study of amphibians and reptiles, and how that's led to my current career, which is mostly focused in conservation policy. So how did I get here? Well, much like this turtle on a fence post, it wasn't by myself. It was through a lot of partnerships, a lot of help, a lot of different collaborations. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in my career and what I've learned along the way. For me, it all started out with these two birds, the American cardinal and the red-winged blackbird. I grew up in Iowa, in eastern Iowa, and spent a lot of time just kind of looking at the critters in my backyard and, you know, down in the creeks and in the parks and places that I would just go explore. And I just became fascinated with these birds in particular. I, you know, was interested in what they were doing and, you know, kind of watching some of the patterns of what they did, and especially with red-winged blackbirds, you know, how they show their epaulets, you know, and can cover them up, and how that's a territorial exhibit, and you know, just kind of trying to learn more about those things. But I was also fascinated with the bunnies and the deer and the turtles and frogs and other things that would come through my yard. And so it was, you know, just a general love of wildlife. And so when I was in 9th grade, this is my really good friend Emily, who lives in Minnesota now, but we grew up together in Iowa. And when I was in about 9th grade, she asked me if I wanted to come bird watching with her and her dad. And I'd never done that before. You know, my family is not an outdoorsy family. We didn't camp or hike or, you know, any of those things, but we did really go to places that were scenic. And so I did have an appreciation for just, you know, like natural places that were beautiful and scenic. A lot of those tended to be national parks that my dad would take us to in the summers. But I didn't, you know, have a specific connection directly to being outdoors or being or observing wildlife. So this is my first experience was with her in 9th grade. And this is us just a couple of years ago out in Minnesota going bird watching. So we continue to do that. But her dad took us out to a place where he observed a great horned owl nest in a tree. And so we just sat there and we were looking, waiting for this owl to emerge. And it was probably about an hour, you know, that we were sitting there, but it felt like, actually it probably was more like 15 or 20 minutes, but it felt like an hour. And I was just observing all the insects around me, the sounds of the wind in the trees and the grasses. And then all of a sudden, the mama owl flew in, and as she flew in, all the little chicks kind of emerged in this knothole in this tree, and they were, like just moving around and just fluffy little balls of fuzz, and it was just the most amazing thing to me. And it was really in that moment that I can still remember, 30 plus years later, that I thought to myself, I want to have a career working outdoors and working with wildlife. So I credit my friend Emily for that. And so many of you now know or might know, or at least from Maria's introduction, that I love toads. And I came to love them just because of, their little frowny faces, for one. But there was a little resident toad in my parents' backyard that would hop around my mom's garden, and, I would observe it. And at some point, we built a little toad hut for it out of half of a ceramic pot that I just kind of like partially buried in the soil. And, we'd see it sort of, hanging out in there, and then coming out, in the evenings to feed. And sometimes it would sit, under our porch light and eat the bugs there. And it just was such a fun thing for me to watch. And so I had a couple of these favorite critters like the toads. And so, like I said, they just have these cute frowny faces. I don't really know how anybody could not love them. But I, was able to, in my career, visit a lot of different places and learn about a lot of different toads. And I've now passed that love of toads on to my daughter, who's now 10. This was a couple of years ago. This is one of her first big toads that she caught by herself. And she just really loves them now too, and asks us, asks me every year when we're going to go out looking for toads again. So I'm happy that I've passed along that love. But for me, where things really shifted course beyond figuring out that that's what I wanted to do for a career was I went to Iowa State University, where I was finishing out my biology degree. And I was talking to my guidance counselor about what my options were for kind of learning more about wildlife ecology. And that wasn't really his particular background. And he didn't really have any advice for me for how I could start gaining experience. And on my own, I found a flyer that just happened to be posted that about this Iowa Lakeside Laboratory, which is in Northwest Iowa. And so the field school, basically, there's a lot of these all around the country. And there's, this was where, so I learned about it. I was able to get enrolled there and take some field courses there. And so while I was at Iowa State, in my normal coursework, I had taken ornithology, or the study of birds, and ichthyology, the study of fishes, and mammalogy. But the following year, herpetology was supposed to be offered. It was only offered every other year. But the professor had retired. And so there wasn't a herpetology course being offered. And the school was also starting to phase out those ologies. And they were going towards more like vertebrate ecology and some of the other, microbiology and, some of the biomedical technologies and those kinds of things. And so at Iowa Lakeside Laboratory, I was able to enroll in a vertebrate ecology and evolution course that was a 5-week immersive course. And the person who taught it was really into amphibians, especially, but also reptiles. And so I learned a lot about amphibians and reptiles there. Got to learn about some of the toad species in that part of Iowa, but also the snakes and skinks and turtles and other critters, birds and mammals as well. And so it was a really great experience, and that gave me a lot of cool sort of field experiences that I could draw from to work towards my career. And so the professor that taught that course ended up inviting me to study with him for graduate school. And what I did in working with him was we created an amphibian distribution map that are set of maps for all the amphibians in the United States. And that database was of interest to the US Geological Survey. They were just starting this new program called the Amphibian Research and Monitoring Initiative, or ARMI. And so this was back in early 2000, and they were hiring new folks to work on these issues of amphibian declines, because amphibians were observed to be declining all over the world, and the causes were still yet unknown. So I was really fortunate to have, good timing and particular area of study that was of interest. And so I ended up working for the U.S. Geological Survey in Maryland at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. And so I worked there for about 4 or 5 years doing field work. Here's me at that time looking at a spotted salamander egg mass. And we had a lot of studies that were specific to spotted salamanders and wood frogs as kind of indicator species around all of the northeastern US. And we worked with a lot of partners and collaborators in various federal agencies throughout the Department of Interior up and down the Northeast. But I got to get out in the field as well, and it was a great experience in the field, and learning about the critters and being able to observe a lot of other critters as well. Of course, we would encounter various mammals and deer, and so started to learn a little bit about the ecology of all of these critters together. And so that field work led to some just partnering work in the Northeast region with this organization called Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, or PARC. And so I started working with PARC in the Northeast region, and they were really partnering with federal biologists, state biologists, folks that were working in other areas of, wetland conservation or water quality, or all those kinds of areas. And that gave me a little bit of a look into kind of the policy considerations for amphibians and reptiles, or in other words, the structures that were needed in order for actions to occur at these different levels, state and federal, et cetera. And then a position came open around the time that my term position with USGS was ending, and I applied for it, and it was for a state agency coordinator position, and I got that position. And so I was a national coordinator working with state agency biologists all over the country. And then one of the things that I learned along the way is that it's not about you. And what I mean by that is I, was of course just starting out my career. Of course, there was a part of me that wanted to make a name for myself, but I found that the better way to work with partners and collaborators was to focus on the issue and to think more about the issue at hand and what was the problem that we could solve and how could we solve it and what partners could we bring to the table to solve it. And, I think what that really helped me understand was that, if you are working collectively towards a goal or a purpose, you can make a lot of progress more quickly. And so, of course, for me in this particular position, it was about the critters, and it was about, how could we make some of these agencies who really hadn't paid attention to amphibians or reptiles start paying attention to them. What would be the ways that we could figure that out? And especially when it comes to amphibians and reptiles, thinking about the critters and how I could help others understand them and appreciate them, or bring people together to help create benefits for them. But with anything new, it can be a little scary to understand something that is different from you, is different from what you've learned, is not something that you've focused on in the past. But you can eventually learn about them and learn that, once you learn a little bit more about the particular issue, a particular critter, maybe they're not as scary or intimidating as you might think. And that was my daughter. When she was, about 2 or 3 there, she was a little unsure about that snake, but here she is a few years later, very, very happy to hold that snake. And now she wants to, catch them herself. In fact, she just told me that yesterday there was a garter snake at school, and she told the teacher she could pick it up because she knew for sure it was not venomous, and they would not let her, and she was very angry about it. So you can win people over by helping them to understand, what it is that is useful about these critters. So this position with Partners in Amphibians and Reptile Conservation kind of merged into a position with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is a nonprofit membership organization that is based in Washington, D.C. And they work with all the state fish and wildlife agencies, so like the Ohio DNR or here Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and all the different agencies all around the country. And so I had the opportunity to work with folks both at the biologist level at these agencies all over the country and at the director level of the agencies and some of the levels in between. And it was a really unique opportunity to kind of understand the issues on the ground and figure out ways that we could help collectively with multiple states kind of working on similar issues together, raise the profile of the issues and bring them forward and create more action. And so the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, as I mentioned, is a nonprofit that is based in DC. They have all of these standing committees that address a whole bunch of different issues. So everything from wildlife diversity and funding, threatened and endangered species policy, and some of these others that are listed here. And I was able to create an amphibian and reptile committee. And what was important about that is that at the meetings of these agencies, when all the agencies come together a couple times a year, through these committees, there are action items that can be raised. And so in creating this committee, I was able to create a platform to bring issues of importance to all the states about amphibians and reptiles and to work through issues with them together. One of the big issues that we found was a problem was the trade and collection of amphibians and reptiles, and also just the regulations around collecting them. And so we put together this report that we called the State of the Union, which was a summary of all the laws and regulations around amphibians and reptiles, and what was possible for commercial collection, personal collection, and scientific collection. And we had the cooperation of all the state herpetologists and biologists, the law enforcement folks, because they were seeing some of the illegal activities that were going on, and all the non-game or the wildlife conservation chiefs throughout the country. And it was a great partnership opportunity to kind of look at what was the lay of the land in terms of these policies and how could we better manage this these commercial collection issues. And so my next insight was that in order to reach especially the directors of these agencies that are typically managed around fish and game and hunting and fishing policies, and not so much around some of these non-game issues and amphibians and reptiles in particular, and a lot of them really were not fans of amphibians and reptiles, was to first understand what was important to them. So this quote that you may have heard before from Stephen Covey of seek first to understand and then to be understood. And so that's kind of the approach that I took. And in working through and figuring out how I was going to do that, what I sort of came to understand is that wildlife conservation and conservation policy in general really takes perseverance. It takes people and people working together and collaborating. And it takes passion, but also compassion. And so what that means, what I mean by that is that you have to understand where people are coming from, try to have some empathy for them and understand sort of what's important to them, and then work with them starting from there. You have to start from where they are and bring them forward. And there are ways that you can do that by being compassionate. And so what I found is that the North American model for wildlife conservation is this kind of big overarching conceptual model that is basically the idea of hunting licenses and fishing licenses. So the idea that you have to pay to remove an animal from the wild. And we don't commercialize deer, and we have very strict regulations for commercial fisheries. So we don't commercialize, deer or pheasants or those kinds of things. And so if you ever buy venison or pheasant or duck or whatever in a restaurant, those come from farmed animals. They're not from the wild. And that is, the result of these kind of conceptual models that these agencies all agreed on. And what I figured out is that could be applied more broadly to non-game species, especially where there's a community that is making use of these wild and native fauna. So in the case of amphibians and reptiles, there's a lot of, pet industry. There is commercial sales for both for pets or food. And so there was an opportunity to kind of apply this model in that way. And so, you know, I had to think of different ways that people were thinking. And so in establishing bag limits for deer or moose or et cetera, you know, they look at the time to reproduction, you know, for that animal. And so in this chart, just very quickly, if you look at the bottom row, the far left column is a snapping turtle. And in the time that a snapping turtle finally reaches maturity and can lay a clutch of eggs, in that same time frame, a bear has reproduced itself 25 times over. A moose has reproduced itself over 100 times, almost 700 times over, and deer, you know, upwards of 900 times over. So in terms of the reproductive cycles, and therefore how many you can take out of the population in order to sort of manage the population, for a turtle, a snapping turtle in particular, it's really low, you know, and you can have a really big impact on the population in just the removal of you know, a smaller number of critters. And so bringing that into the conversation, and thinking through, you know, how we could apply this model to amphibians and reptiles was what we did, and that ended up to be a really effective way to get the attention of the directors of these agencies. And so we discussed this model and, you know, all the different places that we could think about how we manage deer and bear and et cetera, and apply that to amphibians and reptiles. And in presenting this, you know, to these directors, there was a particular director at the time who was, you know, this was a presentation to upper level folks, you know, at these agencies from all around the country, but there was a particular person who was the chair of one of the committees that I was presenting to, and he decided to take issue with the document, even though we'd been talking about it, you know, with folks for a while, and he sort of took issue with it being an implication that the way that he was managing amphibians and reptiles in his state was improper, and he didn't like that I was making that suggestion, which of course was not actually the suggestion. And so what I learned in that moment was my next insight, which is emotional intelligence. And that is the idea that sometimes people react to you in very strong ways, and sometimes it has nothing to do with you or what you've put in front of them. Sometimes it's just because they're having a crappy day. You know, people have crappy days, crappy months, crappy years. You know, when we think back to, you know, some of the time during the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic, and just recognizing that sometimes when those reactions happen in that way, those are happening because of other things that are affecting maybe their lives, but also kind of recognizing how you might be reacting to somebody else, and sort of the idea that you can only control the way that you react. You can't control the reactions of other people, but remembering that it's not always personal, and that there are ways that you can kind of think through those situations and, you know, back off if you need to back off and come at it at a different way. And so that leads me to the next insight, which is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think this applies to a lot of different scenarios. But it's the idea that if you're trying to influence somebody, you know, sometimes you're going to have to work with somebody that doesn't have the same philosophy as you, that isn't someone who, you know, maybe you share all the same values, you know, you might not. But if you want to work with them, you know, it might be uncomfortable, but you have to get comfortable with that, because in any situation to create change or growth, discomfort is part of the process, and the gains are worth it. And so if you can, you know, even in thinking about it from an ecological perspective, disturbance in systems can often be healthy, and it's recognizing that sometimes that system that is getting disturbed might even be your own, and recognizing how you can kind of delve into your own inner workings in thinking about how you work with other people. And so that leads me also to a next thought here. And if you look closely in this picture, that's a toad. See, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here's a toad sitting on top of a rattlesnake inside of a burrow. And that was something that a friend and I observed here in Colorado. And we think it was probably just using the warmth of the snake that probably had just come in from basking. And it was just sitting on that snake to gain the warmth. But obviously these two critters are not, typically hanging out together, could very well be, predator prey. And, so in that same vein, sometimes a partner can be somebody who helps you out and you can work with, but you don't have to be friends with them. You don't have to share all the same values and the same philosophies. But, there are opportunities in thinking about how you can work with folks that you may not necessarily think are your friends. And so, yeah, and I think, related to that, I think this quote from Marcus Aurelius is a really good one, is often the impediment to action is what advances action. So what stands in the way becomes the way. So when you think about the hurdle or the person who's kind of being the roadblock, rethink your approach and think about the way that you can take another angle or come at it from, some other way to be able to advance the action. And I think that's really important as it relates to thinking about conservation policy or advocacy for different policies or actions. And so what I did is I worked with that particular chair, that particular person who was the chair of this committee, talked to him, had several different interactions with him to work with him and think through what things we could maybe reshape, or maybe there's some tweaks we could make. And that was ultimately what he really wanted in this document, to make it acceptable. And it wasn't giving up what we were trying to recommend. It was in some instances just kind of softening some of the language, and ultimately that led to this document being approved. And it is available online. If you Google it, you probably would get to it. And so PARC, again, Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, we have or PARC has this mission statement, which is forging proactive partnerships to conserve amphibians, reptiles, in the places they live. And I think, this picture is another great example of this idea of, your partners are not always your friends. Sometimes you're the gator and sometimes you're the turtle, but you can both bask in the sun as long as you share the space. So that same sort of idea of like, how can you find common ground? There are often instances where we think we are completely on the opposite sides of the spectrum, but there's almost always some sliver of common ground, some area of commonality that you can come to. And especially when it comes to policymakers, often it's even just some other completely unrelated issue, maybe that they're a champion of, or that they've been supporting, that you can say, hey, I really appreciated this thing that you're working on, or just having conversations with them is like, I'd really like to work with you on these different issues. How can we work on them? What are the things that you're thinking about? Here's some things I'm thinking about. What do you think? And having an exchange where you can really develop a relationship and a rapport and figure out what you can work on together. And you're going to be much more likely to get an ear from someone who can relate to you in some way. And so I think that's a little nugget, that I think is really useful in thinking about how you work together with folks on policies. And so another thing that in my tenure with PARC that I was able to sort of crystallize before leaving was our vision statement, which is basically what this boils down to is ensuring that amphibians and reptiles are considered in decisions. There's a lot of decisions that are made in wildlife agencies or, federal agencies, land management agencies, et cetera, all over at all scales that, they're considering, maybe the bigger issues, and sometimes you can bring in the smaller issue and figure out the angle of why that's important and just get them considered in the decision. And that can be a really important thing. Just really quickly, an example of one of the decisions that we worked on was this salamander fungal pathogen, the Trachochytrium salamandrivorans. There is another related chytrid fungal pathogen that affects amphibians in general, that is responsible for the extinction of hundreds of amphibian species all around the world, and a few species, here in the United States that have been really impacted. But this new species of chytrid fungus was found to be especially lethal in in salamanders. And more of the research that was coming forward was showing us that there was 96% mortality in parts of Europe, that it was present from historic species in Asia, in salamanders in museum specimens from even like hundreds of years ago. And so what we also found is that there's a lot of salamanders in trade and captivity. And what was important about that is that over 100,000 salamanders were being imported into the United States. And they were primarily these Asian newt species that happen to be particularly susceptible, or that happen to be carriers of this fungus, this fungal pathogen. And there were a lot of North American species that were related to these particular species that were particularly susceptible. And so if any of you know, like red-spotted newts, for example, that are found in Ohio, they were one of the highly susceptible species. And so with all of these different, considerations and concerns, we wanted to make sure that we can make a link to why we needed a federal policy action to protect salamanders. And here's just an example of salamanders by state. And you can see that in the southeastern United States, especially, and also in California, there's quite a few species of salamanders. So we're not talking about individual numbers of salamanders, we're talking about the number of species. And, Ohio is kind of right in here in the middle with about, just under 20, maybe 15 to 20 species of salamander. But if you think about that in perspective, when one species is listed as endangered or threatened, there's a lot of restrictions that come into place. Restrictions on agricultural activity, industrial activities, forestry practices. There's a whole bunch of other restrictions that can come into play, development for housing, all of those things. And so, it's important to figure out how we could prevent this from coming into the United States. And I neglected to mention that still, as of now, we don't believe that this pathogen has made it into the United States. But at that time, there was a real risk because of this huge trade that was happening. And so seeing this, North Carolina being the state with the most numbers of salamanders, it's actually the Smoky Mountains are the salamander capital of the world. I went to go see Senator Richard Burr and his staff to talk to him about this issue. And, that was the way to influence, is to say, hey, there's a lot of forestry industry. There's a lot of, housing development that's happening. And you have 60 species of salamanders. There's a lot of potential for impact here. And that really got the attention of him and some other, folks in Congress, which helped to influence, some other folks. And it also leads me to my other insight that, nobody's perfect. There were issues on the environmental side for Senator Burr that he was not, didn't have the greatest record in terms of voting for environmental issues. But, because this was a person that is going to care about these other things in his state, there was an angle to reach him on salamanders that was completely, related to the things that he cared about. And so we were able to kind of, through him and through others and their staff, we were able to get some influence and spur some action through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We also were working closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so we were able to get a whole bunch of salamanders that were prohibited from import into the United States. These were, of course, not native salamanders. Salamanders are coming in the pet trade. And the reason we were able to also get the pet industry behind this action, because the whole idea was that we needed to prevent all of the potential for major disease issues and endangered species listings happening here. And I'm really proud to say that, my name shows up in the rule from these conversations that we had with folks in these agencies. And so, like I said, making it about the issues, making it about the critters, what I found was that when it had nothing to do with me, it was really about these issues and these critters that people started to notice. And, that led to a couple of invitations where I was able to give a presentation. This was in Florida, but it was with people from the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And you can see those flags there in the background, but we were talking about trade and in turtles in particular, and the implications there, disease issues and other things that were involved. And so, talking to an international audience about these regulations and the importance of influencing the policy and how we could all work together on that. It also led to a lot of fun things. So I've been on several podcasts now. One of the ways I think that Maria found me was through the Ologies podcast. And, so that's led to a lot of other cool things. And of course, now I can add Cincinnati Nature Center to this list of fun presentations that I've been invited to do and conversations. And so I'm really excited about that. And after I left Park, they gave me their Visionary Leader Award, which was really just a huge honor for me. I was the first woman to receive this award, and only the fourth person to receive the award over the 20-year history of Park. And so I was really excited to be recognized for that reason. And in what they said in recognizing me was that they called me a keystone of, in Park, a keystone species in the sort of Park ecosystem. And if you know what a keystone is, it's that center stone in like an arch structure, but the only way that the keystone stands up there is because of all of the other rocks that are supporting it. And so really, again, all of my work has been because of partnerships and because of other folks working with me. And, I've also learned that in helping other people, to rise up and to recognize their expertise, you end up getting additional opportunities that occur from there. And that, I can look back and I can't really point to any particular mentors that I had that were really valuable. I had some great network connections. And so I was really fortunate in that way that I was able to use those. But, now I'm really focused on the ways that I can mentor others and lift them up. And one of the people that I mentored along the way was a woman who was kind of just getting into conservation policy. And she was an intern with me when I was at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And then she came to work for the state of Colorado in the Department of Natural Resources. And she was kind of brought in as a kind of a policy expert. And she recommended me for a habitat stamp committee, which is a lot like the federal duck stamp, where we were making decisions on funding that was coming into the state of Colorado to protect habitat. And then through that role, I was recruited to the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. And so I was a commissioner, one of these 5 commissioners on the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, which is an appointment by the governor here in Colorado. Was a term position where we were making decisions related to oil and gas development, siting, safety considerations, public health, and environmental and wildlife considerations. And so each of us had different expertise, and mine was in wildlife and the environment, and some of the other folks were in other areas. But it was really interesting to be in that role now as the person being lobbied, receiving advocacy letters, and understanding now to be in that seat, in that position, and to hear the concerns that people were raising and to think through the decision that I was going to make that was going to affect them in some way or another. So I think it gave me a lot of insights, again, about, finding the common ground and what we could do to talk about things together. And what was really interesting to me is, people would come to me, guns blazing, just like the blood is on your hands, you're doing terrible things to the environment, blah, blah, blah. And, I just had to sort of chuckle because, there were times that I thought about those tacts, in approaching other decision makers, but now being, on the flip side of all of that, it really gave me some different insight. And so I was then trying to find, with these constituents, these people coming to me about the decisions, to find where our common ground was, where could we work together? But, I would say that if you're trying to think about ways to influence, decision makers, whether it's, local, municipal agencies, city agencies, county, state, and above, find that common ground. And a lot of times you can look at a particular person's news releases that they've published on their website, issues that they've said they're interested in, and maybe it's totally different. Maybe it has to do with like, providing school lunches for low-income children or something like that, and just talking about how that was really, you really appreciated that, and that was something that was really important to you and your family or your friend's family or whatever it was. And I want to talk to you also about these environmental issues that are important to me, and find ways to find sort of the common ground and to open the door towards these other issues, and think about ways that you can talk to folks. But as the saying goes, you collect more flies with honey. The more you can be positive and approach a person in a positive way, in an empathetic way, compassionate way, you're gonna get further along. And that relates back to what I noted before about first understand the person that you're coming to, and then try to give them your position on a particular issue. So understand what's important to them and the angles that you can then approach them and make those decisions. And so to wrap up here, I just want to note that, one thing that has occurred to me is that all of these policy related actions that I was involved in were really acts of inclusion. So ways to bring in, to think about things that were left out in policies and laws and regulations in the past, and how we could get something new included in there, so that it wouldn't be something totally new and different, but how could we make it part of the existing process of decision making, or the way in which things get done. And what that's also what I've also kind of drawn an analogy to is especially when it comes to amphibians and reptiles, which were these critters that so many people just don't like. And when you talk about reptiles in particular, a lot of people don't like snakes. A lot of people like turtles, like the one behind Maria, but and some people like frogs, but some people really don't like any of them. And even in these agencies that are charged with managing wildlife, you find those folks who really, are in charge of decisions and really don't like these critters. And mostly it's because they don't understand them. And so it was trying to figure out the ways to get them included by helping the folks in the decision-making seats, understand where you're coming from, why it was important to the greater scheme of all the things that are important to them, and getting them included. And what what was really about was getting equity, for these species in relation to the bigger charismatic species. But also, coming from the oil and gas perspective, was thinking about how we could be equitable. And equitable doesn't mean equal. It means finding the right outcomes that fit all the different people that are involved. And so maybe it's ensuring a greater distance of the oil and gas location from a neighborhood or a school, and also ensuring that there are all these safety measures for the oil and gas development, but allowing it to occur in a way that it can still be safe, and not saying it just can't happen at all. So thinking about all these different things. So same thing with wildlife habitat related decisions. If there's something happening that's related to an area that's managed for deer, maybe there's some tweaks that they can do to the management policies that will also benefit other wildlife species. For those kinds of things. And we know from an ecological perspective that biodiversity is really important. So a diversity of species, an ecosystem that's really diverse and healthy, a lot of different plant species, structural components within the habitat, And when you really think about this, it also applies to diversity in general. And so, I've also drawn analogies to amphibians and reptiles as these misunderstood, marginalized, groups of animals in that bigger scheme of wildlife. And how we can really think about that as it relates to people. People just want to be treated fairly. They want to be able to have a say in decision processes. And when you think about it in the ecosystem of society, of your organization, your workplace, those different structures and functions and perspectives when it comes to people, experiences, life histories, all of those things are really important to making for a really rich and healthy culture and environment. And so I think, it's just something I want to leave you all with to think about and to chew on. And, I'm really proud now to be with the National Parks Conservation Association, where I'm able to think of all of these different things in the realm of conservation. And, I came from a place where I was really somebody, as I said, who didn't come in with an outdoorsy background, definitely, didn't have parents who hunted or fished, and ended up in this realm of wildlife agencies. And I was really trying not to rock the boat. And now I'm really, just pleased to be in a position where I'm rowing the boat and, helping to direct things in ways that I think are going to be, helpful both for the critters, the landscape, and the people that I work with. And so with that, I'll stop and hope that there are some questions. And thank you so much again for the time.
Thank you so much, Priya. Just getting this both up on the screen here. So we do have one question, and it's kind of a career-based question here. So what jobs could you recommend in conservation for someone with an environmental studies degree if they want to make a difference?
Yeah, I think, an environmental studies degree is really great for thinking about some of these policy and advocacy activities. There's a lot of environmental nonprofits out there, like National Parks Conservation Association, Wilderness Society, Audubon, a lot of these groups that engage in policy activities, where that environmental studies background, a lot of that is about the laws, that kind of govern environmental policies, the basis, for the different actions that have occurred, and the ways that lands have been managed or protected. And so I think that's a really great place to potentially start. And there are a lot of, internships, a lot more paid internships now. Thankfully, those were not really available when I was coming up. And so it was finding those unique opportunities, but there's a lot more paid internships out there. There are, entry-level positions where you can really work your way up. There's a lot of folks in my organization, National Parks Conservation Association, where folks came in with completely unrelated degrees, and some even who started out in like administrative positions and then worked their way into other positions just after kind of hearing about the issues and learning about them and working with people along the way. And so I think there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of other agency related positions at like local and municipal, county, and even state levels that you can find opportunities there too. But like a nature center is a great place to work with an environmental studies degree. And there's a whole bunch of them all over the country.
Thank you. We have a question from Connie. How can individuals find out about conservation policies that need our support?
Oh, that's a great question. A lot of these same organizations, have Instagram pages, Facebook pages that you can follow and learn about the issues. If you care about national parks, you can follow our pages, and they will bring forward these issues that, there's an opportunity to contact your senators, or, here's an opportunity for you to engage and ask for certain things, in your local area. you can get engaged with local chapters within your community. You know, there's like state, you know, Audubon and Sierra Club and, you know, some of these other groups that are out there. But even engaging with your state wildlife agency, like sometimes there are opportunities to work with them. Right now, there's a policy in Congress, a bill in Congress called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, that is really close to being passed. There's a lot of bipartisan support for it. And it would give a whole bunch more money, especially to non-game species. And it would keep a lot of species off the endangered species list. And that's really, you know, kind of the push behind it and why it has such bipartisan support. So that's a really good one. But yeah, I would say just, you know, kind of look at some of the groups that you know are doing good things, or if they're a particular critter group that you're interested in, you can find, you know, kind of the nonprofit groups that are working on those.
And I kind of have a question that goes along with that. Your answer might be similar, but as a person who is not super immersed in policy and, you know, doesn't have a lot of career experience, if we're individuals, what are some things that we can do to make a difference at the policy level? Because sometimes it feels so overwhelming that we don't even know where to start or how to make a dent. Any advice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I totally understand that feeling. I can tell you, I had zero idea that I would be anywhere in the policy space. You know, I was a biologist. I just was interested in the critters, and just came into it and just, I guess, you know, had both an interest and a knack for it. And, but I think that, you know, starting in, you know, understanding what's happening at your really local level, you know, what are the parks departments, you know, considering doing for different species, or what are, you know, what are the issues that are affecting your favorite critter? And then trying to find out, like, what are the, you know, are there particular actions that you can get engaged in? And that's, again, where your local, you know, nonprofit groups especially can help, but you can also learn what the wildlife agencies are working on. And sometimes it's things like they're trying to get additional funding even through the state legislature. And you can help, you know, get even those governmental agencies, you know, some help. And on the federal side too, you know, there's a lot of great policies that come up that you can engage in just by contacting your local representatives, even on the, like, in the House and in the Senate. But beyond that, you know, we just had an election yesterday, and, you know, voting and really understanding where your representatives stand on particular issues that you really care about. And, you know, that really runs the gamut. It can be from everything, like I talked about with school lunches, or, you know, things like that, to, you know, environmental policies. Like, did they vote for these important policies that would have protected lands? Did they, you know, support different bills and those kinds of things? And there's a lot of places that provide scorecards. So we have an affiliated group called the National Parks Action Fund, and they have a website that has a scorecard for, you know, all the different representatives and senators in terms of how they relate on park related policies. But a lot of the other organizations do the same for, you know, whether it's various critters or various, you know, land management and conservation policies, water conservation policies, all those kinds of things.
Thank you. We have a question from Sarah. Any thoughts about the impact of the health of amphibians as it relates to native plant life? Native plants is a thing that we talk about a lot at the Nature Center. Is there any relationship there?
There is a little bit in that, you know, native plants, you know, definitely provide the best habitat for the local amphibians. And, you know, a lot of times, like when wetlands get clogged with non-native species, or even the upland landscapes of grasslands or whatever that get, you know, invasive species like, you know, smooth brome, I think, is an issue in Ohio. And there's, I don't know if kudzu is up there, but there's like a bunch of other, you know, non-native plants that really choke out. Oh, good. Choke out the native plants. And so figuring out how you know, just ensuring that your own yard is, you know, has a lot of native plant abundance and diversity is really helpful, or that making sure that that your local land management agencies are addressing, native plant considerations in their habitat management policies. That's a way to ensure that, and that'll help all the critters, not just the amphibians.
Mm-hmm. James is asking, where do zoos come in with conservation?
Oh, that's a great question. And yeah, and I should have mentioned zoos as another place to look into, even within environmental studies or other background, or just even interest. Like definitely a lot of people come up as being like vet techs and go into the zoos, and there's a lot of opportunity to help the critters there. More and more zoos are doing local conservation as well as kind of like international conservation. So they might have their giraffes and pandas and whatever, but they also have, more of the local species because, there's a lot of recognition in the zoo community that they can do a lot for working with the zoos. And so there's opportunities to, in some cases, there may be opportunities to help with captive breeding programs or reintroduction programs that they might be working, with the state on. You can get, internships or volunteer opportunities at the zoo to help, just starting off with just like, feeding the animals or, cleaning cages or those kinds of things, and work your way up into other positions. And yeah, I know a couple of people that started, really from the ground up in zoos and found, got into some really cool positions there that they're making some really great decisions, like, thinking more about the native species. That's
Great. I think we have time for one more question here before 8 o'clock. So this is from Gus and Sherry. In your travels, do you find that there is growing interest in park and other wildlife agencies, especially with the up and coming generations?
That's a great question. I think yes. I think there have been some polls that demonstrate that, nature activities, certainly because, during the pandemic, people were outdoors a lot more because obviously that was safer before we knew, all the ways to keep ourselves safe. And there was a huge increase in interest and a lot more people that are getting into hiking and camping. I think there's still a concern about kids, getting outdoors. And I think the best thing to do is, if you have kids, grandkids, if you have opportunities to volunteer with kids and get them outside and just looking at, as simple as like a butterfly garden and the different butterfly species, or the toads in your yard or at the nearby wetland, or, those kinds of things, it can get them to at least just appreciate, even if they don't end up in, influential careers of any sort. But I do think that there is still a growing interest in, sorry, I meant to say that the poll shows that wildlife viewing has really increased, even though things like hunting and fishing maybe have gone down a little bit. There are certain sectors that are going up, like women are hunting more, different people of color are fishing more, but wildlife viewing kind of across the board, is going up. And that I think also has to do with that increase in like being interested in being outdoors.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't seen that statistic.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up for the night, just to, make sure that we're running on schedule here. If we didn't get to your question, feel free to reach out to us at onlinelearning@cincynature.org. I'll put that in the chat as well. I do want to give a heads up that we have one more talk in our Changemakers series on December 7th. And this is with Lila June, who is an Indigenous musician and community organizer and scholar, and Jerry Neri, who is the founder of the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition. So we'd love for you to join us for that talk as well. All right, so big thank you to Priya. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. And
thank you, really appreciate it.
And I hope you all have a good night. Thanks, everyone.